Hello, welcome to Deprogrammed on Unsafe Space. I am your host, Keri Smith, and I'm joined today by a special guest, Neil Shenvi. Neil has a PhD in theoretical chemistry from UC Berkeley and an AB in chemistry from Princeton. He is a writer. He homeschools his 4 children through classical conversations, and he can be found on Twitter at Neil, Neil Shenvi, Shenvi. His writing on critical theory from a Christian worldview perspective can be found at shenviapologetics.com. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Keri. Thank you for inviting me here.
I'm so happy to talk with you. You won't know this, but if you don't watch our show, I don't think you do, but you're requested quite a bit to come on the show. So I'm excited to finally get to speak with you. Yeah. So we do a bit of this show, if you haven't seen it before, and for anyone who's new, who's watching, this is a specific show we do in Unsafe Space where we talk about social justice ideology. It's my old belief system, and we try and make sense of it for me and for anyone else who's following along. And one of the things that's happened over the past few years is, I guess I'm a pretty new Christian. I've become more open about my beliefs, and Carter's my co-host, has kind of pulled some of that out of me. And I was really shocked to find social justice, this what I think of as a belief system, in my old belief system, in the church. Mm-hmm. And so I would love to talk with you about that. If you want to start with, there's an essay of yours I read, which is about whether the two can coexist. Can you tell people a little bit about that essay?
Sure. I have actually a lot of essays that are entitled Social Justice, Critical Theory, and Christianity. Are they compatible? Okay. Talks like that. So it's hard to know which one you're even referring to. But the bottom line is that we first have to define our terms carefully. And this is a good rule for any discussion. So when people talk about social justice, you have to ask, well, what do you mean by social justice? So, for example, the ESV Study Bible has a header in Exodus 22 that talks about laws about social justice. Now, no one thinks the ESV Translation Committee is a bunch of progressive Christians trying to smuggle Marxism into Christianity, because those laws are things like caring for the poor, but also like applying the death penalty to certain crimes. So they're not referring to social justice in some kind of progressive sense at all. So if you define social justice to mean biblical justice, well, that's obviously compatible with Christianity. Of course, what is biblical justice is a different question. But my only point is that you have to define your terms. What I would say is that what we see today in the social justice movement, the underlying ideology behind that kind of social justice is totally incompatible with Christianity. And the term that's used, I think the best term to use for all of this woke stuff that's out there, is actually critical social justice. It's a term used by Robin DiAngelo, who's a very well-known author and anti-racist educator. And it's used elsewhere in the scholarship, but critical social justice is completely antithetical to Christianity. And that's what we really see in a lot of these anti-racist justice organizations today. Mm-hmm.
That has been my experience too. And I think that's why I was so surprised to find it in the church, because it's so at odds with what I've been learning about God and about a better way of living and being, and to see this old faith of mine there. I would describe it, this is the best way I've come to describe it, and I'm still working on this definition, but it's a belief system that says that we should look at the world, the best way to look at the world is as a competition between identity groups for power, and that we need to redistribute the power among these different identity groups. And it's sort of centered around gaining and attaining power. And it's also, because it tells you to look at the world with this lens, as a competition between groups, it wants us to look at people as collectives based on what race they are, what sex they are, instead of as individuals. And so I find that so at odds with the Bible. Can you talk a little bit about, you say that critical social justice, which is a term Robin DiAngelo uses, is antithetical to Christianity. What are some of the tenets of this belief system? And specifically, maybe we could just go through some that are not at odds with Christianity and some that are.
Well, I think the way you described it is exactly right. It's a comprehensive lens through which you view reality. It's a framework for understanding all of reality. So the idea of power dynamics, group identity, things like that. They're all part of it. So when I try to describe what are these core tenets of critical social justice, I list 4 ideas. And now this is great because you have been in this movement. So you can tell me whether this sort of begins to make people often just intuitively grasp these ideas but can't put a name to them. But when I lay them out and say, well, this is in the literature, then they're like, oh, a light bulb goes off. So here are the 4 sort of central tenets of critical social justice. The number 1 is the social binary. So society is divided into groups, oppressed groups and oppressor groups along lines of race, class, and gender. I'm going to just quote here, by the way, just to make sure no one thinks I'm making this up. I'm going to quote from Sensei and D'Angelo's book, Is Everyone Really Equal? They write, for every social group, there's an opposite group. The primary groups that we name here are race, class, gender, sexuality, ability status, exceptionality, religion, and nationality. And here's another book. This is Adams' Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. She writes, the manifestations of social oppression in the U.S. that are focused on in this book are ableism, ageism, adultism, anti-Semitism, classism, heterosexism, racism, religious oppression, sexism, and transgender oppression. And they actually have figures that label various groups as oppressors and various groups as oppressed, and then list their various oppressions. So this is not just Robin DiAngelo's crazy idea. This is something that's all over the literature. So that's the social binary number 1. You can divide society into oppressor groups and oppressed groups. The second idea is, well, you say, wait a minute, I don't really see a lot of oppression going on today. I mean, I see that, sure, some groups have more wealth than others, some groups are disadvantaged relative to others, but I don't see things like, large-scale slavery. There's sex trafficking. There is even modern day, but I don't see like an entire, say, ethnic group that's enslaved in the U.S. today. So you ask, well, what do you mean then by this oppression? Well, the answer is that critical social justice defines oppression in terms of what's called hegemonic power. So again, I'm going to quote word for word from Sensei and D'Angelo. They say that hegemony refers to the control of the ideology of society. The dominant group maintains power by imposing their ideology on everyone. So the idea is that what makes a group an oppressor group, what makes them dominant, is not that they coerce and are tyrants and that they abuse other groups. It's that their ideology suffuses society as what's natural and objective and taken for granted. So for example, they would say the patriarchy is the ideas associated with masculinity being the norm. White supremacy are the idea that whiteness, as they define it, is the norm. Heterosexism is the idea, the oppression that says that heterosexuality is the norm for humanity. So whatever group has their identity as the standard, what's normal, what's default, that is the oppressor group, and all other groups are oppressed by that hegemonic power. Okay, so
right.
Number I have 2 more. I'll be fast. Yes, right. Go ahead.
No. That one, first of all, yes, this is exactly what they do. So they view it as this competition for power between identity groups, and they do. They put everyone in that binary of oppressor, oppressed. They also use a sleight of hand. I'm sure you've seen this. They will substitute those words oppressor and oppressed for privilege and marginalized sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So whether they want to be, I think, more histrionic or not, it's like, privileged, but then suddenly it's oppressor. And they have trouble with, because it's such an easy binary. One of the things I've found, we can get into the weeds of some of this stuff later, but once they put someone in a group, if they buy into this ideology, they have trouble criticizing people who are in these so-called oppressed groups, unless that person doesn't speak the social justice ideology, then they're fine with it. But for example, usually I find if there's some kind of disagreement, they will always side with based on identity markers. They will side with people, whether or not, well, this person's in more oppressed groups or this one's in more oppressor groups. When it's someone like, do you remember the case a few years ago of the woman who was suing because she was being forced to do, it was a Muslim woman who was being forced to do waxing on a transgender woman.
Yes.
They couldn't decide what they thought about that. Because on the one hand, you've got Muslim, which they consider an oppressed group. And on the other hand, you have transgender, which they consider an oppressed group. Right. And it just sort of short circuits the system.
So then, it's a good segue into my third tenet here, which is related to lived experience. And so the idea of lived experience is that all of the ways we have of thinking about reality are actually the function of, hegemonic, white, heteronormative, masculine discourse. And so because of that, so all of us, whether we're oppressed or oppressors, All people are socialized into this dominant discourse, this white, Western, masculine, heterosexist way of thinking. So all of us essentially are blinded to reality. Both oppressors and oppressed. However, people from oppressed groups can gain what's called a critical consciousness or a liberatory consciousness. Colloquially, they can get woke because their lived experience tells them, no, actually, what I'm seeing is not normal or objective or neutral. It's actually that these hegemonic ideas have been imposed on me by the dominant group to justify my oppressed status. So therefore, oppressed people can wake up to their oppression. They can get woke. And then because of that, they have basically taken off their blindfolds. So we should defer to them to teach us about social reality. So here a quote from Charles Mills. He writes, hegemonic, that's dominant groups, characteristically have experiences that foster illusory perceptions about society's functioning, whereas subordinate groups characteristically have experiences that at least potentially give rise to more adequate conceptualization. So this picture here is that all of us are wearing blindfolds, but people from marginalized, oppressed groups, through their lived experience, can take off the blindfolds, and then they have access to truths that we are blind to because we're privileged. So that's why. So then, if there's a dispute, who do you listen to? You listen to the person who's more oppressed. Why? Because they have better access to reality, at least about their oppression, which is why you get people like, who do you side with, the Muslim woman or the transgender woman? Well, it gets hard to tell who's more oppressed and therefore has a better view of reality. And then, so finally, the whole goal of critical social justice and actually of related disciplines like critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, the entire motive force behind these movements is social justice. So they're all trying to achieve what in social justice, they define that as, and I'll quote Mary McClintock here, as the elimination of all forms of social oppression, where that can take many forms based on a person's gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, etc. So their definition of social justice means deconstructing and dismantling these systems which produce privilege and subordination. Okay, so those are the four. So social binary, hegemonic power, lived experience, and social justice.
Yeah.
Does that sound? So you tell me. Am I creating a straw man here? Is this or is this an accurate picture?
This is accurate. And just to be clear, you were never in it, right?
No. Mm-mm.
Oh, but you can see it for what it is.
Well, that's the thing. So when me and other people like Vodi Balkum, other Christians who are warning people about whatever you want to call it, so critical social justice, wokeness, whatever, when we characterize it as a worldview or even as a pseudo-religion, I mean, James Lindsay's an atheist, it's the same thing.
Right.
Helen Pluckrose in their book call it, David French, who's a conservative commentator, has called the intersectionality as a religion. I can name all these people from various political beliefs, various religions. They all say this is functioning as a religion. And people tell me, oh, you're being dramatic, you're being alarmist. And I keep saying, no, it's right in there. It's a way of viewing all of reality. So I get accused of misrepresenting these ideas, but you're saying, no, that actually was how it functioned for you.
It is actually functions like a religion, but even, I would say more accurately, like a cult, like a very fundamentalist religion. And we've done, coming out of something like that, it's a slow process. So it wasn't like I woke up one day and said, oh, I'm done with this belief system.
I've read your first essay, I think, which was you were very much you were not just saying, oh, it's a cult. You're like, something's wrong with this. I'm not sure I believe this. Yeah.
That's a while ago now. That was 2017 probably. And that was after getting over 6 months of fear where I was silent about what I was thinking about and trying to. So I think, first of all, the way that people are drawn into it, a lot of times they don't recognize it as a religion. I didn't recognize it as a religion because it's not as if you're approached by someone who says, let me tell you the good word about
here's a tract,
my belief system. It's not that. And you're not going to one meeting where, you're getting pulled into this new way of living. And I've read a lot about cults. I've watched a lot of cult documentaries since leaving this one. And there are some big differences that I think make it hard for people to see what it is. But once you're in it, they usually will pull you in by, it's gradual. They'll give you one belief at a time. And so if you're a woman, for example, sometimes you'll come in, there are a lot of doors to social justice. I came in through the feminism door. But people come in through the critical race theory door. Critical race theory, which of course is in the news a lot lately, that's just one door into this. I think of it as social justice or critical social justice as this massive umbrella, and underneath it you have all of these different parts.
That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. So, you walk in that door and they tell you to start thinking of yourself as, if you're a woman, as a member of a group, and start looking at oppression throughout history, and why would you think that oppression is now over, and here are some ways in which you're oppressed. And they start to tell you to think about male privilege, all the ways that men are privileged that you're not. Of course, they don't have you do the opposite. We're never sitting down. We're never asked to think, what are some ways in which I might have privilege in certain circumstances because I'm a woman? They're never going to ask you to do that. But once they get you to buy into a part of it, then it's sort of slowly, they introduce you to these other, okay, well, let's now take that and apply it to race. It's the same thing with race. Yep. You happen to be white in this case, so you're in the oppressor group. Do you see all these ways that you're privileged? That I never thought of this, And I've seen Robin Angelo do interviews about this. I saw one recently that the Myth Informed guys put out where she said the first time she realized she was white was in her 30s. Did you see this?
Yeah. Well, I saw that on Twitter that she has an out-of-body experience, right?
Yes, an out-of-body experience. And you want to talk about a religion, it borrows a lot from Christianity. Yeah. In that interview, she said, once I realized I was white, I read that the checklist of white privilege, I had an out-of-body experience. And then I was ashamed, and I didn't want to go outside because I felt so loud in my whiteness. I thought people could see my whiteness. And it really made me think of the creation story of Adam and Eve.
Hiding,
Yes, once she discovered her whiteness, her shame, her sin, it was like, I can't go out and be seen by people. And that really made me think of trying to hide in the garden from God. I know
in his book, in How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, he actually says at one point that his parents were Christians. And he says that the spiritual needs that were fulfilled by Christianity for my parents are fulfilled for me by anti-racism. He says the same spiritual longings. Yes. He says that. I'm like, well, he's saying it. I'm not even saying it. And there are other examples of I
didn't know that.
Yeah, no, I pull up the exact quote, but he himself compares it to, being converted to, and actually a lot of anti-racist authors, including Christian authors who embrace anti-racism, will talk about it as being reborn into an anti-racist identity. They'll say you've been born again once as a Christian, and now you need to be born again into anti-racism. That's like the language they use. Another metaphor they use a lot. I can name several books that do this. They use the parables of the story of Jesus healing the man born blind. Or various times Jesus does that. And they'll compare their journey to that, how Jesus has healed them from being blind to racism. And they will say, not just like, oh, I was blind, now I see. They'll say it's like that story in the Gospel of John, or it's like the story in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus heals the man, he can sort of see, and then, but so it's clearly, I think part of the reason it's so successful, and actually my collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer, and I talk about this in one of our articles, it's so successful is partially because it's meeting spiritual needs. It's giving you a sense of, it misidentifies, but it identifies the source of your shame. You're ashamed because you're part of the system of oppression. And you're also, it says you're in denial about it. You don't want to admit it because if you admitted it, you'd have to own, and then it says, but once you own your racism, your classism, your sexism, here's how you can atone for it. Here's how you can make things right. You can do the work. You can, do the research. You can, you can divest from your privilege. So it's giving you a way and that's the Christian term for that is justification. From a Christian perspective, there's Christianity is a meta narrative. It's a story, and we use that sort of to explain to understand all of reality. The story of Christianity is creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Right? We were created by a holy God who's good and loving. And our problem is that we rebelled against God. Adam and Eve did, all of us ratified that decision. We all rebel against God. And so we are condemned by God as sinners, and we have this shame and this guilt. Like we said, we hide from God. We find our fig leaves, we cover up our guilt and our shame. But then God, to rescue us, sent Jesus to redeem us, to die on the cross and rise from the dead for us. And the end goal then is that one day Jesus will fix all of reality, right? He'll redeem us. So that's the story arc of Christianity. Well, critical social justice has a completely different story arc, but it has the same sort of categories. Our problem is not sin, it's oppression. But the problem is that we're not primarily creatures of holy God. We're primarily people in these various demographic groups locked in a struggle for dominance. Our problem is oppression. The solution is not redemption. The solution is activism. We have to dismantle these unjust systems. And then the end goal is, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The new heavens and new earth is this world of where all these barriers have been torn down, where groups share power. But it provides people with a sense of meaning and purpose. It shows them has a moral grid: what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. Where do I invest my time? And then ultimately, it gives you a sense of justification. You feel like I am righteous. I'm one of the good people. I'm not like, the one of these tax collectors, prostitutes, these sinners out here. I give a tenth of all I get to charity. I do the work. I acknowledge my white privilege. And there's this real sense, and you can see it in people like D'Angelo and Applebaum. They're constantly feeling guilty. They're constantly washing themselves, trying to get out the damned spot. But we know that as Christians, we know that in some ways can cover up the real problem. You can find other ways to be your own Lord and Savior that don't involve trusting in Jesus. So anyway, it's fascinating to view this as an alternate way of salvation. Yeah.
That's an interesting point there at the end, other ways to be your own Lord and Savior, because that's what it's missing. They're constantly trying to wash out the damn spot because it can't be washed clean. There's no number of works that you can do in this belief system. It's ultimately unsatisfying. It does meet spiritual needs, I would say, for a short time. Or long. I was in it for 20 years, but there was something deeply wrong, and I knew it. I knew it on a gut level. I just couldn't explain it. I had never really thought deeply about it, and it doesn't offer you grace. There is no. There's no redemption. It's you basically are your own. You and the ideology are your Lord and Savior, and then there are some people within the ideology that are sort of you look to as high priests or priestesses is what I call them usually, but people like Robin DiAngelo or Ibram X. Kendi, and they change over time. They're not always the same. They're popular. These who are popular now may not be popular in 5 years.
Sure.
There'll be others that rise up, but it's ultimately unfulfilling and empty because you can never apologize for, you can never do enough work, you can never divest yourself of your privileges enough. And
that's another thing actually they said explicitly. By like people like D'Angelo Kendi, but also it's a continual, it's a lifestyle, it's an identity, it's a perpetual self-examination. And again, what that would correspond to in Christianity, at least, would be this continual mortification of the flesh. You're always seeking to put to death the works of the flesh. So there are all these fascinating parallels. But like you said, the main difference is grace. The idea that I can be cleansed from my sin once and for all by what someone else did for me.
Not by me.
Nothing like that. Not by me.
What I do.
It's not about me being good. And the funny thing is, we point out in an article that this is why, in principle, Christians should be so willing to forgive. I mean, Jesus says this: the one who's been forgiven much loves much of him, and then the one who's been forgiven then forgives others. But if you don't have a sense in which that you've been forgiven of much, this is why cancel culture is so brutal, because there's no forgiveness for them, so they're not going to offer forgiveness to other people. Whereas Jesus says, look, if I've forgiven you this humongous debt, then you have to forgive others when they do no worse than you. So they're both parallels, but also, as you said, it doesn't, like all other ways to be justified, it doesn't work, because the problem is deeper than our racism, sexism. The problem is deeper than social structures. The problem is our rebellion against God. Anyway, so interesting.
So can you tell me a little bit about your background as a lead into what is happening in the church currently with this incursion of social justice? I have an idea of how big the problem is, but it's just based on my gut and anecdote. So I don't know. I'm a pretty new Christian. So tell me a little bit about your history, and then tell me what you see happening currently in Christianity in the West.
Sure. So I grew up in a very loving but non-Christian home, and I became a Christian in grad school, actually, at UC Berkeley, through knowing my wife, through reading a lot of C.S. Lewis's. I read the Screwtape Letters like 20 times. As a non-Christian,
We just read that for book club last year. It is so relevant right now.
It is. It's interesting because I read it as a non-Christian. I just read it over and over and over again. And I kept thinking to myself, how does he know what's going on in my head? I said, this is uncanny, because when he's describing all the posturing, the guilt, the rationalization, it's like he's describing me. Yeah. How can he, and of course, how can he know that? Is it because he knows what the Bible says about human condition? He knows, so anyway, but I read that over and over again. And I became a Christian in grad school, basically realizing that it's as simple as saying, no, you know what? I am a sinner. I do need a rescuer. And Christianity is the only religion out there offering someone besides me to fix myself. I can't fix myself. I can't go become a Buddhist where they say, well, just fix yourself. It's like, I can't fix myself. That's the problem. Yeah. And obviously there's much more to it than that. But I became a Christian in grad school. And then because I was in the sciences, I became interested in apologetics, so defending the Christian faith using reason and evidence. And all my colleagues were scientists, and many of them were atheists. And I wanted to be able to explain to them, well, why is it true? Not just true for me, true for you, but just objectively true for everybody. So I launched into that. It's been kind of my passion for the last 15 years. And I was completely apolitical. I mean, I was a chemistry major in college, in grad school. And so I just wanted to show people that, okay, the Bible's reliable. Jesus rose from the dead. God's the source of morality, things like that. Basic apologetics arguments. I couldn't care less who was present. That's just not something I did. And so I was, for 10 years, I was engaged in apologetics, trying to explain to people why Christianity was true. But then I'd say around 6 or 7 years ago, I began noticing this change where people weren't really concerned about whether Christianity was true, but whether it was on the side of the oppressed, whether it was going to work for social justice. And I was kind of like, well, if it's not true, who cares whose side it's on? But that was more and more what people were thinking about. And then I saw a similar drift in both people I knew personally and in public figures who started out just saying, well, we want to care about social justice. And I just assumed that meant applying biblical principles to our laws. And I was like, yeah, who's against that? Like, no, I don't want laws against murder. No, of course I want those kind of laws. So, but then the same people would begin espousing beliefs that are more and more heterodox. And I couldn't figure out why. And so finally, I heard Jordan Peterson quote from a book called Race, Class, and Gender. And I was listening to Peterson just because he was really popular at the time. I was trying to understand why he was popular. I'm not a huge fan. I was curious. But he read this quote where it said, I memorized the quote. It said, the idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine idea, one that we will challenge throughout this book. So and I was like, wait, what? You think that the idea that objectivity is best achieved through rational thought is a Western idea, a masculine idea? And so I got to read this book. So I bought the book. It's 500 pages long. It's an anthology, and I read it. And when I put it down, I was like, I understand what's going on now. It's not just people adopting a few new beliefs about politics. It's them adopting a new worldview. Yes. And so that's you're saying yes but I immediately, and that was the first book I read on this subject, and so then I immediately put down everything else and began just reading voraciously on topics like critical race theory, critical pedagogy, the deeper down the rabbit hole I went, the more I was like, this is a real problem. And so that's my story of how I became concerned about critical social justice.
Yeah. I think, it's funny. When I was leaving Los Angeles, I was also in the very beginning period of leaving social justice. But again, like I said, it was a long period. And I got rid of a lot of my social justice books. I kept a few. I believe I had that anthology. And
Anderson and Collins, right? Anderson and Collins, Race, Class, and Gender. It's a green book.
I kept a bunch of the ones that I still had some sort of emotional attachment to. Like I loved Bell Hooks, and I still have a lot of hers. But this is, you're not wrong about how to read something like that. You're not wrong about how absurd that is. That there's no objectivity. That there's no way to look at something and for us to all come up with agree upon a definition for a term or a word. Like you did at the beginning of the interview. They don't believe that. And there's, I think of it as trap doors and secret passageways in a way in a house of belief. They have a lot of secret passageways where you feel like you're having a conversation. We're both sitting here together, and then they take a secret passageway because they're both, I don't believe in objective truth. Boom, door shut, they're gone.
Yeah.
You're like, okay, well, then I don't know where we go from here. I thought we were also, the same.
Yeah, they redefine a lot of terms like things like racism, sexism, oppression, white supremacy, social justice. And the other thing, too, is that they often will play, this is a common observation, what's called a Mott and Bailey game, where they make some claim like, objectivity is a myth, right? And then you say, wait, what? Objectivity is a myth? Wait, and they say, no, all we mean, so they retreat, they make this crazy claim, then they retreat and say, well, no, all we mean is that everybody has their biases. I'm like, well, yeah, I believe that. But then when you call them out, they'll retreat to a safer place. But then when you see how they're applying it, now they wouldn't, most people, most scholars wouldn't deny. They're not postmodernists. They would not deny wholesale that objective truth doesn't exist at all. However, when you press them on it, they would say objective knowledge doesn't exist, meaning that everybody is conditioned by their social location. So in practice, that allows them to challenge basically any claim of objective truth. When you say something like, as we saw on Twitter for the last year and a half, if you say 2 + 2 = 4, they will find ways to challenge that. Now, so they're like, they don't deny objective truth outright, and yet you'll see them constantly denying the most basic objective truth claims. So again, you have to, if you don't understand how their ideology is working, you get tricked very easily. Because it's like, oh no, I don't deny objective truth. I just deny that 2 + 2 = 4, because that's part of our Western system of numbers and conventions that have developed over. So anyway, there's a lot. This is partly how people get sucked in because they don't understand. They hear words like, and this is maybe your other question was like, how do Christians get sucked into this ideology? Yeah. Well, you hear words like oppression and justice, and you're like, those are in the Bible. When you use the word like we should stand up against oppression, I'm like, literally, Isaiah 53 says Jesus himself was oppressed and afflicted. That's a biblical word. So you assume you're using the word the same way that I am. And that's a completely false assumption. So that's how, so when you hear Christians saying like we need to oppose white supremacy, well, who doesn't want to do that today? We need to oppose racism and sexism. Sure. We need to oppose we need to oppose systems that grant privilege. You're like, yeah, sounds good to me. Little do you know that Christianity is one system that provides privilege. You're going to dismantle that now. Anyway, so there, like you said, there are various doors into the house of critical social justice. There are various doors from Christianity into critical social justice. And one of them is, again, taking terms that you think understand and using them and then realizing 5 years later that, oh no, I've been sucked in to this worldview that I didn't even realize it. Yeah.
They're very concerned with language, very concerned with language and changing the definitions of words that we used to commonly have, commonly accepted definitions for racism and sexism. And they have to redefine those because they're preying upon people, a lot of them, people with a lot of good intent, and who believe what this ideology says it is. This is about ending oppression. It's about ending racism and sexism. So how do you get those people to then engage in racism and sexism? You have to change the definition of those words. And that's one of the first things I learned when I got pulled into it. For anybody who doesn't know my story, who might be watching this one, I went to a dismantling racism training when I was at Duke University. That was my first introduction. And sometimes, I said earlier, it's not like, they're handing you a tract and inviting you into the cult, but often there is some kind of training at the beginning for some kind of initiation. Yes. And that was my first one. So Christians, could you talk a little bit more about why you think, I know you said they use certain words that people are primed to care about, like oppression, for example. But are there any other reasons why Christianity in particular might be vulnerable to intrusion from this ideology?
Sure. Yeah. So number one, again, and this is for everybody, I guess, but anyone who in their right mind is going to say, I'm against justice. Like people are like, well, we're pro-justice. Well, who's anti-justice? Nobody is. So the funny thing is that it's a very clever form of framing where you take terms that everybody supports, like justice or I'm going to be anti-racist. Well, point out to me who's pro-racist? Like there's no one. So by redefining these terms and then smuggling in their definitions, they get almost everybody to support it, or at least they get people who have reservations to get very nervous. Like who wants to stand up and be the guy who says, actually, I don't think we should subscribe to anti-racism. Oh my gosh, you're pro-racism.
Right.
No, I'm just saying that what they're calling. So what I do a lot of times on Twitter and just in general is that I just say, before, I just say outright, who wants to be opposed to anti-racism? Nobody. All of us want to oppose racism. But before you go to an anti-racism training seminar, you ought to understand how they might be defining the term. So I'll just throw up quotes from Kendi or D'Angelo or Applebaum and just say, this is in their own words, what they mean by that term. Do you subscribe to that? And then they'll think, whoa, so that's what's giving people information about what these terms actually mean. It's interesting. In many ways, there are a lot of the group that's done this most with Christian language is like Mormonism. Mormons use all this Christian terminology and just redefine it. So you can talk to a Mormon for a long. And I actually know people who work with Mormons and who do ministry to Mormons, but they'll say you can have a conversation for like a half an hour with a Mormon and just assume they're Christian because they're using words like grace, faith in Christ, the resurrection, the Son of God, all of these terms, and you're like, you totally understand, you believe the same gospel that I do. But if you read the actual literature, you're like, no, they don't believe the same gospel. And I think some Mormons will just, we don't believe the same things. But again, they've redefined all those terms so that it sounds like they do. So in the same way, some of the work that we can do is simply to show people what they mean by these words. That's one good route. So another, I think, major route in the church today, for the last 10 years, has been through racial reconciliation discourse. So I think lots of Christians today rightly look at our nation's past and more specifically at the church's role in racism over the last 300 years, 400 years. And they lament that. They look at it, they're like, this is terrible. You read just the history. Forget about these ideological tracks. Read the actual history of slavery. It's horrendous. And it's not that ancient. I mean, I had a woman in my Bible study who's now a doctor. She's a black female doctor, and she remembers going to a segregated school as a kid. So it's not like, you're not like, don't let the bygones be bygones. So this is like a woman in my Bible. She's a wonderful woman, but she remembers that. So they see that, they're like, I do not want to repeat the same sins of my parents, my grandparents. I don't want our nation to repeat those sins. And then you have this very, very vocal secular movement saying we can help. We take racism seriously. We take history seriously, and we can show you how to dismantle systemic racism and to not make the same mistakes that the white moderates did in the 50s and 60s. And so people are very, receptive to that with very good intentions. And then conversely, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
This is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Social justice tells you that the best, as we talked about, the best way to interpret the world is as this struggle for power between these different identity groups. We need to redistribute power. And the way that you do that is you treat people differently based on which of these groups they're in.
Sure.
And so they are telling us we must judge and treat people differently on the basis of what race group they're in, what sex group they're in, what sexuality group. On the basis of all these immutable characteristics, we have to treat them differently. That's racism and sexism, but they've redefined it. And so as you're talking about this, you're reminding me of something I'm thinking about a lot lately, which is that to me, as a Christian, it just seems the devil found a new way to sell a very old thing. And also thinking of the screw tape letters, it's so clever. It's like, oh, look at this. If you were to think of a character like in that book who's sitting back, a demon, and looking at society and like, wow, they're moving away from racism and they're moving towards, viewing people as individuals and treating people as individuals over time. How do we get them to treating people as members of a race again?
Yeah.
Let's appeal to that desire never to repeat the sins of the past, and let's call racism anti-racism. I mean, that's exactly how I view it now. I've started to be in these very simple terms of like, wow, we're getting back. We were progressing, and now we're going backwards again.
Right, and I think the one of the other problems too is that I think Christians respond to, I think, clearly dangerous and sinful approaches to race. Like, well, we just need to discriminate against whites. I mean, actually, I just read a quote in Bridges' book on the critical race theory. She's a critical race theorist, where she just overtly said, and Kennedy said this too, but it's okay to treat people differently if they're differently socially situated, meaning it's okay to treat blacks and whites differently because blacks and whites are not, as a group, differently situated. And I think Christians, to me, there's a sense in which it's actually okay. So, for example, if it's 1867 and blacks have just been freed from slavery, or I guess 1872, after the 13th and 14th Amendments. So then I would say, yes, it is reasonable to say, as a group, blacks and whites are not on the same level playing field because of what literally just happened, right? Mm-hmm. But so in a sense then, or say take the Holocaust. In 1947 in Germany, Jews as a group were situated differently than Germans as a group. It makes sense to talk about, okay, look what just happened. Okay, 2 years ago, it's okay to think about how can, say, German society rebuild itself so that Jews are recognized that they've been directly harmed. But then we have to ask, at some point, when does that end? It can't be that for the next 1,000, 2,000 years, we continue to treat Jews and blacks and any other group differently. And here's the other thing, too. We should recognize it's convenient to talk about, well, we ought to treat, say, blacks differently because they just were freed from slavery in 1872 or whatever. But here's the thing. The way to think about that, it's not at all based on race. It's, well, were you just a slave? If you were as an individual, then clearly we should treat you differently. So it's not, you're not really saying, oh, blacks should be treated differently. You're saying that former slaves should be treated differently. So you can recast that way of thinking in terms of individualism. Right. It's not that, whereas I think critical social theories would, because they're so focused on collectives, they really see no problem with, like you said, collectivizing the entire group and ignoring the individual. Yeah. So I think, even today, I would say that we don't have to today say, well, let's just be completely, quote unquote, colorblind and never even talk about race. I think that's also a bad approach because there is real racism in society today. Yeah. And if you just ignore race completely, you have to ignore racism. But I think that that's one extreme. The other extreme is, but wait a minute, you can't then turn around and, like you said, institute neo-racism where you treat individuals differently purely on the basis of their race. That's just as wrong as what we did 100 years ago. So yeah. I just think there has to be recognition there are dangers on both sides, but that really, if you look at, again, I make biblical arguments, and Pat and I talk about this in a lot of articles, but for Christians, and this should be a no-brainer, God's moral commands are given to all people universally. It is not true that what is a sin for you because you are a woman or because you are white or because you're heterosexual is not a sin for me because I am half Indian or because I am No, God's law is for all people. The Bible's so clear on this, and we're all held to that same standard. And crazily enough, I see Christian groups beginning to question that sort of basic doctrine that the law is for everybody. We're all judged by the same standard. Wow. There's no partiality with God. There are Christian groups that will literally say things like, if a person of color, a Christian group focused on racial reconciliation, will say in their guidelines, if a person of color in this group, and you're a white Christian, if you're white and a person of color yells, screams, or cusses at you, just take it. because you don't understand their pain. Like, you're like, no, that's a sin. You can't start yelling at me just because I happen to be white and you happen to not be white. That's a sin. We should, now I'm not saying, okay, in love, extend grace, but at some level we have to say that's not going to be normative behavior in our group. It's not how we achieve unity So anyway, so there is some room for nuance, but I agree. I really get concerned when people start just obliterating the idea of universal standards of behavior.
Yes. And they don't believe in any universality, like that you can even empathize with or understand the pain of someone else, that's even possible. Your race or your sex or your sexuality or your whatever, all these different groups they put you in, these things will prevent you from being able to empathize with someone who's in a different group.
And it's not just empathy. So I talked somewhat about critical race theory, which is sort of a subset of all these critical social. There's one critical social theory, but critical race theory began as a legal discipline. And one of the things that marked critical race theory, a bunch of legal scholars, was their rejection of universals, rejection of abstract reasoning. And so it's not that this is like, you're like, well, this just happens, some radical extreme activists are embracing this rejection of universals. This is like legal scholars at UCLA and Harvard saying that the law itself, we should reject universal abstract reasoning and focus on context. Well, for this person, in this situation, this is just. Not what's just for all people at all times. And I think as a Christian, that's not how justice works. We can recognize that, sure, in some cultures, some laws are, but there are indeed some universal abstract principles that just define justice. And we're getting away from that. It's super dangerous.
Yeah. It's a selective application of laws.
It's complete. See, there's so much here. You have to understand that the way critical social theories are very because they reject universalism and abstract reasoning, they're very pragmatic. They're goal-oriented. So one of the departures that critical race theory made from its precursor, which was critical legal studies, is they said, look, critical legal studies said all law is a mechanism for the ruling class to impose their values on culture. All law just does is it justifies the power of the ruling class. But critical race theory was much more pragmatic. They said, look, that might be true, but we still should use the law to advance justice. They said, you guys you're a bunch of old white guys. This was their criticism. You old white guys can sit on in your nice air-conditioned offices and talk about how these laws are just mechanism for power. But on the ground, as activists, we want to use the law to get justice. And so we're not going to just dismiss law as a mechanism of oppression. We're going to actually use the law to advance our causes. And you see that pragmatism everywhere in these movements because, like I said, there's double standards. There's no consistency. They're not really being inconsistent because one of their core beliefs is it's all about justice. Forget about your logic and your reason and your universal principles and it's about what happens on the ground. So anyway, there's so much. Yeah, go ahead.
That will explain, I think, for a lot of people who don't understand how they contradict themselves so often. And my co-host Carter, I can't wait to have you back on at some point with him because he talks about pragmatism all the time. He's an atheist, an enemy of pragmatism, but it's sort of, they will use words. It took a while for me to understand this after coming out of it. They will use words as tools simply to get what they need in any given situation. And that's why the words don't have a lot of meaning, and they change the meaning of words, and they're tools for coercion and control. They're not tools for greater understanding. So when they say things like they don't hold themselves to behaving as if they even believe the words they say, depending on the context. So example, on a lot of their signs, they will put things like silence is violence, and they, which is a lie, first of all, but it's not even a lie that they believe. They don't believe that is a coercive tactic to get you to speak their ideology. They want you to speak their ideology and not be quiet about it. If you speak something else, they will be the first to tell you to shut up.
Yeah.
They would prefer your silence than for you to criticize the ideology. They don't believe silence is violence.
Again, it makes sense. Here, why does it make sense? Well, it makes sense if you believe that all words and all rules are just mechanisms of power. If you already believe that all words are just tools of power, then of course you're going to use your words of power because everybody's doing it. In the same way, or laws. Or another accusation, people will say you're just playing identity politics. And they'll say yes. But why do they say, they have no problem with that? Because they would argue that white men have been playing identity politics for 400 years. So they're like, everybody's playing identity politics, so why shouldn't we? So and you say, well, shouldn't we appeal to abstract justice? No, because it doesn't exist. All you've ever been doing, all the U.S. has ever been doing is reifying white masculine identity politics. Now it's turn for us to enact identity politics. We're not, so in their minds, so they're not appealing to some objective transcendent standard because to them, no standard exists. So why not just, exactly. So my only point is I'm just trying to, once you get into their worldview, you realize they're not really being hypocrites. They're being consistent. they're just doing what is basic common sense if you adopt their worldview. So, and that's why, again, I emphasize, that's why we shouldn't adopt it, because it will lead you to these places. You assume that by talking the language of white privilege and white fragility and, defining oppression in a certain way, that, I'm doing that as a Christian. And I'm like, but look, the very foundations of the way they're using these words is based on a totally non-Christian worldview. You can't, and you're going to be pulled in two directions as long as you do this.
Yeah. What advice would you give to Christians specifically who are finding this in moving into their church, and Christians and then Christian parents?
I get that a lot. So for parents, definitely you have to immediately start training your kids, because one of the reasons that Christians also are adopting these ideas are just, I wouldn't say cultural pressure, I'd say cultural influence. We're living in the world like everybody else. And so we are bombarded by these messages about anti-oppression, anti-racism, equity, inclusion. And so it's no surprise that we begin sort of repeating those words and thinking in those terms. So we have to actively resist that way of thinking. It's in the water. In fact, I'd argue it's a hegemonic discourse. So I'm going to go ahead and borrow from Gramsci here and say, actually, the real hegemonic discourse in our culture today is wokeness. And we need to be counter-hegemonic. We need to be organic intellectuals and resist that pressure to adopt these ideas. Anyway, for kids, my 12-year-old son can already talk to you about what critical theory is. Now, again, he's kind of precocious, but the point is you can begin teaching your kids to identify what's wrong with these assumptions. And so in terms of I'd really recommend the book Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth by Thaddeus Williams. It's a great book. It's very accessible. And it's a great book to hand to a very zealous high school or college student who is just diving in headfirst into critical social justice. Williams is going to kind of pull you back and say, are you sure of what you're doing? Let's ask some important questions about what justice is, who God is, what the gospel is. I actually wrote an essay for that book. Samuel Say, Monique Duson, I think, wrote essays. So it's really some really good people to hear their stories. And anyway, so Thaddeus Williams, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. Good book to hand to your older kids. For younger kids, just talk to them about things like, what is justice? Who is God? Tell them a story. What's the problem with humanity? Is it oppression or is it my sinful heart? What's the solution? Is the solution that we should all just be nice to each other, or the solution that God had to come in the form of his son to die on the cross for our sin? Is that the solution ultimately to all of our problems? And then give them a way for Christians to actually work for justice. If you want to be an activist, yes, you can be an activist, but just make sure that you're acting on behalf of biblical justice. And then for churches, what I always say is, ask good questions and listen. So because if your pastor happens to utter the phrase social justice one day in a sermon, don't assume immediately that he's a Marxist. Mm-hmm. Just invite him to coffee and say, hey, I noticed you mentioned this phrase. What did you mean by it? So ask good questions, listen to the answers, and then raise these concerns. Maybe give him a book like Williams' book. Another great book, it was a more scholarly book, is Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He's mainly talking about transgender ideology, but he talks about more generally about how all of that is part of the larger critical project that's invaded our culture. So give the pastors books like that, and ask a lot of questions. Make them define their terms carefully. The other thing that I would do is make it very clear that you're not trying to oppose. You're not trying to promote racism. You're not here to promote sexism. You're fully behind efforts to resist and to reject racism, sexism, injustice. That's great, but you're concerned with another issue, which is how are we understanding those terms and what ideas are we latching onto that are from our culture. I think I have found in general that when Christian leaders finally begin looking into these issues, they are suddenly horrified. Even people that are like, oh no, it's white privilege, it's a real thing, and systemic racism is a real thing. And again, depending on how you define those terms, they might be, but when you say, wait a minute, look how they're defining it, then suddenly they're like, wait, what did I just do? So it takes time. So be patient with people, extend grace. But I do think it's a serious problem, and I when the church has to confront, because culture is going to do what culture does, but Christians have to be committed to what Scripture tells us. And we can applaud culture when it does what is good, but we have to reject it when it does what's evil, and be vocal about that, and equip your people want to bury their head in the sand and just hope it all blows over. This is not going anywhere.
No.
So I warn people people are like, well, once Trump's out of office, I was like, in October, I was like, I don't care who wins. Yeah. Wokeness is going to get worse, because if Trump wins again, oh my gosh, that's going to validate all these narratives. But if Biden wins, as he did, well, they're going to see an opportunity to extend their ideology even further into culture, which we're seeing now. So I said recently on Twitter, if you think it's bad now, wait until all of the current high school, college, and seminary students graduate and get into positions of leadership.
Yeah.
So that's why, as a pastor, you have to equip people today, immediately, to recognize and reject this ideology.
As Carter, my co-host, says a lot, it's, he's an advocate for homeschooling as well. And he talks about, it's not about teaching children what to think, it's about teaching them how to think. But also at the same time, he agrees, giving them a worldview, because if they don't have one, somebody else is going to give them, someone else will give them a narrative for how to look at the world. Mm-hmm. And, in my case, this ideology, I didn't have a worldview when I encountered it. And I think a lot of people are left vulnerable because they have either, I was raised in a Southern Baptist church, but I had recently walked away from that. I went to a science and math high school. And at that school, I started, questioning a lot of my beliefs, which I don't think is a bad thing, in investigating them, interrogating them. But then I sort of walked away from God for a while. And during that period is when I first started encountering some of these ideas. Without even realizing it, I had adopted and welcomed this other narrative, this other lens through which to view the world into my life. And
it's really like giving your kids a better story, right? In Christianity, there are propositions that are true, but also it's a story of redemption. It's the good news. And so it was a really funny story. When my son was little, like maybe 4 or something, he was playing with little Lego figures, like Star Wars Lego figures, and they were having a battle or something. And I said, "Hey, what are you doing, buddy?" And he's like, "Well, this is the good guy, and these are the bad guys. They're fighting him." And they shot at him. He said, "But this bad guy, well, he repented." It's amazing. So in his play, he was thinking in Christian terms of like, well, there's good and evil. There's a battle between good and evil, but through repentance, we can have forgiveness. And that as a 4-year-old, he was understanding that's the story we live by. And I'm not saying we should always remain that sort of basic level of like, there's good and evil, and I'm evil, and I need to repent. But what a beautiful story we can tell. And it's, like I said, it's more fulfilling because it's like, yes, there's good and evil, but I'm not the good guy. God's the good guy. I'm the bad guy who repented. I'm the bad guy who was forgiven much, and therefore I love much. And that story, that better story is what's going to make the, critical theory lose its luster, because it's so works-based and bitter and ultimately defeating. So yeah, I think that's, as a parent, what we can do most of all is teach your kids the goodness of the good news.
Yes. I love that, Neil. So tell everybody where they can find you online and what you have coming up. I know you're working on a book. Are you talking about that yet?
Yeah. So online at Neil Shenvi, on Twitter at NeilShenvi. I tweet way too much. But you can find me and keep track of I'm always reading and writing book reviews and giving talks and things like this. So you can follow me there. I actually have a book under contract in publication, actually, with Crossway. It is not about critical theory. It is about apologetics, but it should be out next July. And then I'm hopefully also going to write a book on critical theory with my collaborator, Dr. Pat Sawyer. So we're working on it.
Cool.
So hopefully that'll come out eventually at some point.
Well, we would love to have you back. If you ever would like to come back and talk about the book, we do a book club and could feature it as our book of the month. So Great. Thank you so much for spending time with us here today, giving us the benefit of your wisdom. And I'm really happy to have met you. And I know there's a lot of people in our audience who are going to be really happy to hear from you. So
Great.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks, Keri.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy, so go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, well, mostly. And you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to its thinky talk. The following co-conspirators have been unpersoned and will be recycled as part of our sustainability program. Don't be sad. You can't make an omelet without purging all dissidents. Honestly, I am worried that you have been exposed to extremist content. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks at the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.